For years, I carried the weight silently, watching as my parents poured their resources, love, and attention into my younger sister Lila, while I was left to fend for myself. It wasn't just neglect, it was betrayal, wrapped in the guise of favoritism. And when they handed her the keys to a house they refused to help me buy, something inside me snapped. This wasn't just about property, it was about worth, about being seen, or rather, not being seen at all. It started innocently enough, or so I thought. Growing up, our family dynamic always seemed lopsided, though I convinced myself it didn't matter. Lila was the golden child, bright, bubbly, and effortlessly charming. She could light up a room with her laughter, and my parents adored her for it. Me? I was the steady one, the dependable son who never caused trouble, but also never seemed to dazzle anyone. While she danced through life on clouds of praise, I trudged along quietly, doing what needed to be done without expecting applause. But adulthood has a way of exposing cracks that childhood glosses over. When I graduated college and began building my career, I quickly realized how expensive life could be. Rent, student loans, car payments, it all piled up faster than I could manage. I asked my parents for help once, not a handout, just a modest loan to get me through a rough patch. Their response stung more than I cared to admit. "You're smart. You'll figure it out." Figure it out, I did. I worked overtime, picked up side gigs, and lived frugally, determined to carve out a stable future for myself. Meanwhile, Lila floated through her 20s like she was untouchable. When she decided to move out of her apartment, my parents didn't hesitate. They bought her a house. Not a modest starter home either, but a sprawling 3-bedroom with a backyard big enough for entertaining. They framed it as an investment, insisting it would appreciate in value and secure her financial future. But to me, it felt like salt in an open wound. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, families have their quirks, their biases, their blind spots. Maybe this was just one of ours. Still, resentment simmered beneath the surface, growing sharper with each passing year. I threw myself into work, climbing the corporate ladder until I finally reached a position where I could afford a down payment on my own place. It wasn't glamorous, just a modest condo in a decent neighborhood, but it was mine. Or so I thought. The day before closing, disaster struck. A plumbing issue turned into a flood, causing thousands of dollars in damage to the unit above mine. The seller backed out, citing unforeseen repairs, and suddenly, my dream slipped through my fingers. I called my parents, hoping they might reconsider their stance and offer some assistance. Instead, they reminded me of their earlier advice. "You'll figure it out." Their words echoed in my head long after the call ended, taunting me with their indifference. How could they justify giving Lila a house outright while refusing even a fraction of support for me? Was I really that disposable to them? Anger burned hot and fierce, consuming every rational thought until only one idea remained. If they wouldn't see me, I'd make sure they couldn't ignore me anymore. The plan came to me late one night, as I lay awake replaying old grievances in my mind. Revenge isn't something I ever imagined myself pursuing. It felt petty, childish even, but the injustice of it all consumed me. If they wanted to play favorites, fine. I'd give them a reason to remember exactly who I was. I started small, leveraging connections I'd made during my years in the workforce. Through a colleague, I discovered that Lila's new house had been purchased under questionable circumstances. My parents had taken out a second mortgage on their own home to finance it, leaving them financially vulnerable. Armed with this information, I approached them, feigning concern. "Have you considered what happens if something goes wrong?" I asked casually over dinner. "What if the market crashes or Lila can't keep up with maintenance costs?" They dismissed my concerns with practiced ease, assuring me everything was under control. But doubt lingered in their eyes, planting seeds of uncertainty where none had existed before. Satisfied, I moved on to phase 2. Over the next few weeks, I subtly sowed discord between them and Lila. I mentioned offhand comments about how much time and energy owning a house required, hinting that perhaps she wasn't ready for such responsibility. To my surprise, the tactic worked better than I anticipated. My parents grew increasingly anxious, questioning whether they'd made the right decision. Meanwhile, Lila grew defensive, accusing them of doubting her abilities. Tension mounted until it reached a breaking point. One evening, during a rare family dinner, the argument erupted. My mother accused Lila of taking them for granted, while my father lamented the strain the purchase had placed on their finances. Lila fired back, reminding them that they were the ones who insisted on buying the house in the first place. As accusations flew across the table, I sat silently, watching the chaos unfold with grim satisfaction. When the dust settled, relationships were fractured beyond repair. Lila moved out of the house, unable to bear the guilt of causing such turmoil. My parents, burdened by debt and regret, retreated into themselves, avoiding conversations about the past altogether. And me, I stood on the sidelines, victorious yet hollow. But revenge is a double-edged sword, and its wounds cut both ways. In the weeks that followed, I found myself haunted by memories of happier times, family vacations, holiday traditions, moments of genuine connection that now felt irretrievably lost. The anger that had fueled my actions began to fade, replaced by a profound sadness. What had I gained by tearing them apart? A fleeting sense of vindication, hardly worth the cost. Determined to salvage what little remained, I reached out to Lila first. She met me reluctantly, her usual confidence replaced by vulnerability. "Why did you do it?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes. "Didn't you care about us at all?" Her question struck a nerve, forcing me to confront the truth. No, I hadn't cared. Not then. But maybe I could start now. Over coffee, we talked openly for the first time in years, sharing fears, regrets, and hopes for the future. Slowly, painfully, trust began to rebuild. Reconnecting with my parents proved harder. They were guarded, wary of my intentions, but I persisted, showing up uninvited to family gatherings and offering help without strings attached. It took months, maybe longer, but eventually walls crumbled and forgiveness took root. Looking back now, I realize that revenge didn't heal the wounds. It merely widened them. True healing came later, when I chose empathy over bitterness, understanding over judgment. Life doesn't offer easy answers, and forgiveness isn't a destination you reach overnight. But sometimes the hardest lessons lead to the deepest growth. In the end, Lila didn't just lose a house. She gained a brother willing to fight for her. And my parents didn't just lose their savings. They rediscovered the son they had overlooked for so long. Because love, even flawed and complicated love, is worth fighting for.